At 3:47 in the morning, her sister's apartment was so quiet that Corinne could hear the refrigerator shudder in the kitchen 9 hours before she would walk down the aisle to become the wife of Brant Whitlock. She had only come down for a glass of water, nothing more. Then Adeline's phone lit up on the counter, and Corinne stopped, not because of the name glowing on the screen, but because of something smaller than that. The phone wasn't locked. Adeline was an attorney. Adeline never left her phone open in the middle of a kitchen table. Corinne told herself there were 100 harmless reasons. The flowers, the seating chart, the menu, but her finger had already slid across the screen on its own. Can't sleep. Keep thinking about last night. I don't know how I'll get through tomorrow, Addie. The kitchen floor seemed to tilt beneath her feet. She read it 3 times, trying to force those words into some innocent meaning, then scrolled up. Message after message. Back through weeks. Back through 4 months. Corinne lifted her head, the gray wool coat draped over the back of the chair. 2 unwashed wine glasses in the sink. The man who would take her hand beneath the ballroom lights in 9 hours had been here, last night, in this apartment, the apartment her own calloused hands had paid the rent on for 10 years. She didn't smash the phone. She didn't wake anyone. She wiped her cheek with the back of her hand, took out her own phone, and photographed every line calm as a woman gathering evidence for a trial of her own. 9 hours later, beneath the warm lights of the Beaumont House ballroom, among 180 smiling faces and a wide screen waiting to broadcast the ceremony, the minister smiled and asked whether anyone objected to this union. Corinne let go of Brant's hand. She did not cry. She did not tremble. She simply turned toward the front row where her sister sat in a wine-red dress and gave a small nod to the technician. The screen came to life, and in that very moment, the wooden doors at the back of the hall swung open. A man stepped through with a slight limp in his walk, unhurried, in no rush at all. 180 heads turned at once. Then the entire room fell silent, because the man who had just walked in was not on Brant's guest list. He owned the building. If you want to know what appeared on that screen, and why that man came through those doors, press the like button so we know you're here with Corinne. Share this story with someone you believe deserves to hear it. And subscribe to our channel so you never miss the healing stories still to come. Corinne's old car was parked exactly 2 blocks from the building, beneath a street lamp that had been broken since last winter, and she sat behind the wheel for nearly an hour without starting the engine. Snow fell lightly, gathering little by little across the windshield until it formed a cloudy white veil that hid the road ahead. And she let it cover everything because she didn't want to see anything else anymore. Her hands were still trembling, not from the cold. She took out her phone, opened the series of photographs she had just taken in that silent kitchen, and only then did she realize that earlier she had been pressing the shutter over and over, screen after screen, so quickly that she hadn't had time to read a single word. She had taken those pictures like someone afraid the light would go out before she could preserve the evidence. Now, in the darkness of the car, she began reading again from the beginning, one image at a time, slowly, as though each one were another step leading downward into a place she had never known existed. The first image, the second, the third. The words were familiar in the cruelest possible way, because she recognized her sister's voice in them, that gentle voice Adeline had used for 10 years to soothe her after night shifts, the voice that had always told her, "Don't worry, I'll take care of everything." By the 9th image, Corinne no longer felt pain. There was only a numbness spreading from the center of her chest, all the way to her fingertips. Then she reached the 11th image, and went completely still. It wasn't a text message. It was a screenshot Adeline had sent to Brant, and on it was the family's joint account. The same account Corinne had been depositing money into every month for 10 years, the account they had begun calling something else around the house 2 years ago, Ezra's kidney transplant fund. The remaining balance was only a small fraction of the number she knew by heart. Corinne read that line 3 times, just as she had read the first message 3 times in the kitchen, and this time she didn't try to force it into some innocent meaning, because numbers don't know how to lie the way people do. She didn't swipe to the 12th image. She couldn't. There is a limit to how much a person can take in during a single night, and she had just reached it. She placed the phone face down on the seat beside her, leaned her head back, and in that silence, memory rose on its own without asking permission. 10 years earlier, she had been 17, sitting in the administrative office of her high school with a withdrawal form in front of her, and no one had forced her to sign it. She had picked up the pen herself and written her own name, because she was the only person in the family who could see clearly that if she didn't start working, there would be no one to take Ezra where he needed to go and bring him home again. That day, Adeline had been standing in the hallway, wearing the brand new suit she had bought for an interview at a law firm. her eyes red with tears, holding her little sister, and saying she would spend the rest of her life paying her back, that it would only be a few years, that once she was on her feet, Corinne wouldn't have to do anything anymore. Corinne had believed her. She had believed her for 10 years, through every night shift, through every winter morning spent waiting for the bus at 6 o'clock, with cracked hands hidden inside her coat pockets, through every birthday her sister forgot, right up until 3:47 this morning. Inside the car, she let out a very quiet laugh, a laugh with no joy in it at all, then stopped abruptly, because she was afraid that if she laughed one more time, she wouldn't be able to stop. Her phone vibrated. A message from Brandt. "Sleep well, my bride. Tomorrow is our day." Corinne stared at those words for a long time, long enough for the screen to go dark on its own, and she realized something strange about herself. What she felt wasn't the urge to cry, and it wasn't the urge to call someone and scream into the phone. It was a kind of icy clarity she had never known in her life. She thought about Ezra asleep in the small room on the 3rd floor, 20 years old, his college enrollment deferred for 2 years, sitting still for hours 3 times every week, and not once had he complained to his sister. She thought about the waiting list she still checked every month, and she understood that what had happened in the kitchen tonight wasn't the story of a woman being betrayed on the eve of her wedding. It was something else, something larger than that, something older than that, and she needed to know how large it truly was before the sun came up. For the second time that night, Corinne wiped her face with the back of her hand, cleared the snow from the windshield with the wipers, and started the engine. The transplant center was on the 4th floor of the East Treatment Wing, and at 5 o'clock in the morning, the hallway leading to it held nothing but white light, and the distant echo of cartwheels rolling somewhere far away. Corinne had walked this route more times than she could count over the past 2 years, always with Ezra beside her, always carrying the cloth bag with a thin blanket and a bottle of warm water for him, and this was the first time she had come alone. There was only one employee at the overnight reception desk, a middle-aged woman finishing the last part of her shift, and she looked up when she saw a young woman approaching, with swollen red eyes and snow still caught in her hair. Corinne said she was the sister and the person listed as financially responsible for the patient, Ezra Holloway, and that she needed a copy of the complete payment history from the day his file had been opened. The woman asked whether something urgent had happened. Corinne only said that she needed to know everything, right now, before 7 o'clock in the morning. Perhaps there was something in her voice that made the woman decide not to ask another question. She simply nodded, checked Corinne's identification, then turned toward the printer behind her. In the empty hallway, the sound of the printer was so clear that every mechanical beat could be heard, and Corinne stood there with both hands resting on the edge of the counter, listening as each warm sheet of paper slid out and settled on top of the last, exactly the way a truth is sometimes assembled, one piece at a time. When the woman handed the stack across the counter, Corinne took it, sat down on the row of plastic chairs in the hallway, placed it on her lap, and began reading from the first page. For the first 2 years, everything was normal. Every charge had been paid on time, steadily, month after month, and she realized she was smiling foolishly as she looked at those lines, because they were traces of her own life, of the nights she had stood beside an oven until 6 o'clock in the morning to earn every one of those numbers. Then she turned to the final page. For the most recent 3 months, not a single payment had been made. The transplant program evaluation fee, unpaid. The cost of staying in the patient housing near the center during the preparation period, unpaid. The accumulated copayment for the entire year, unpaid. And beneath those were 2 dry administrative notes, each only a single sentence long, stating that the center had sent 2 reminder letters. Corinne read the mailing address and went completely still. Both letters had been sent to the apartment whose kitchen she had been standing in, only just over an hour earlier. Both had been received. She set the stack of papers down on the chair beside her, leaned forward, clasped her hands together, and for several minutes she couldn't think at all, because her mind kept circling one very simple question that had no answer, that if her sister had received the first letter and said nothing, then when the second letter arrived, what had she been thinking? Corinne sat in that hallway until the light beyond the window at the far end changed from black to silver gray. During all that time, she didn't cry. She opened her phone and photographed every page, then borrowed the computer in the corner of the family waiting room, plugged in the small USB drive she always kept in her wallet for storing baking recipes, and began transferring everything onto it. The photographs from the kitchen at 3:47 in the morning, the screenshot of the joint account, the complete payment history that had just been printed. She arranged everything in exact chronological order, numbered every file one by one, as carefully as she measured every gram of flour, and when she was finished, she removed the USB drive, closed its cap, and held it in the palm of her hand for a long time. It was so light that it seemed to have almost no weight at all. At that exact moment, her phone vibrated, and Ezra's name appeared on the screen. Corinne stared at that name, drew in a deep breath, steadied her voice, and only then answered. Her younger brother's voice was still thick with sleep, a little hoarse, and he laughed before he even managed to speak, saying that he had woken up earlier than the bride, that he had just tried on his suit again, and the sleeves were a little too long, but probably no one would notice. Then he asked if she was nervous. Corinne sat on the row of plastic chairs in the middle of the hospital hallway, still gripping the USB drive in one hand, looking toward the window where the sky was beginning to brighten, and she told him she was fine, that she was just a little short on sleep, that he should go back to bed for a while. Ezra laughed, wished his sister happiness, and hung up. Corinne lowered the phone and sat motionless for a very long time, because in all 27 years of her life, she had never lied to her younger brother even once, and she had just done it for the first time. To understand how Corinne could sit through an entire night in a hospital hallway without falling apart, you have to go back nearly 10 years, to when she was 18, and walked into the basement pastry kitchen of the Beaumont House Hotel for the first time. Her shift began at 10 o'clock at night and ended at 6 o'clock in the morning, and she chose it not because she loved the darkness, but because the night shift paid more than the day shift, a difference an 18-year-old girl supporting her younger brother couldn't afford to turn down. For the next 10 years, she slept during the day, stayed awake through the night, and the entire city knew her only through the pastries that appeared on breakfast tables without anyone ever asking who had made them. Her hands changed before her face did. The skin over her knuckles thickened and cracked every winter, and the tips of her fingers grew so calloused that once she grabbed a hot tray, and it took several seconds before she felt the heat. The long scar along her right forearm was a mark from her first year, when she was still clumsy with the door of the industrial oven, and Rosalind Pike was the one who pulled her arm beneath cold running water that night. Rosalind was 61, and she had been the head baker there for longer than Corinne had been alive and half as long again. And she taught her craft the way people of the old generation often did, which meant she showed you once and only once. And if you remembered, you remembered. She never asked Corinne about her family, never asked why an 18-year-old girl had chosen the night shift, never asked why every month she volunteered for extra shifts on holidays. Everyone else fought to take off. She simply watched, remembered, and whenever she saw Corinne standing too long at the kneading table, she quietly set a cup of hot tea beside her and kept walking. 10 years passed that way, and Corinne learned how to live peacefully in that basement, because down there no one looked at her, no one pitied her, and no one made her explain her life. Until one November evening, when the head baker told her to take a pastry cart upstairs to the main lobby and restock the restaurant's dessert station. Corinne pushed the stainless steel cart through the employee corridor, stepped into the service elevator, and when the doors opened on the ground floor, she emerged into the warm golden light of the grand lobby, with flour still dusting her apron, and her hair tied neatly beneath a cloth cap. In the center of the lobby, about 10 steps away, Adeline was standing with 3 people in suits, all of them carrying leather briefcases, all of them having just come from the law firm after a long day. Corinne stopped for a single beat, and in that beat, something very young rose inside her, a small, foolish kind of joy. The joy of a little sister suddenly seeing her older sister somewhere she never expected to. She smiled. Adeline saw her, and Corinne noticed her sister's eyes pause for exactly 1 second on the apron, on her hands, on the cart, and then slide away. One of the men in the group caught the look and asked cheerfully whether the two of them knew each other. Adeline turned to him and smiled with perfect ease, the same smile Corinne had seen hundreds of times over family dinners, and said that she worked here. The sentence was very short. It fell into the lobby, and no one picked it up. The man nodded, turned away, and continued the conversation they had been having about some inheritance dispute, and the group walked toward the restaurant. Corinne stood still for exactly 3 seconds. Then she nodded, a very slight nod meant for no one at all, and pushed the pastry cart onward toward the dessert station. Her hands rested on the handle with complete steadiness, without the slightest tremor, and not once did she lower her eyes to the floor. She placed every plate of pastries where it belonged, straightened the labels, wiped away a drop of cream clinging to the edge of a tray, then pushed the empty cart back to the service elevator and pressed the button for the basement. That night she worked until 6 o'clock in the morning. She kneaded 2 extra batches of dough no one had asked for, wiped down every steel work surface again, and reorganized the ingredient storage in an order she herself knew wasn't necessary. Rosalind passed by several times, saw everything, and didn't ask a single question. When the shift ended, when everyone else had hung their aprons on the hooks and were talking and laughing outside the employee entrance, Corinne still hadn't said a word to anyone. She stepped out into the cold, stood waiting for the 6:15 bus, tucked her cracked hands into her coat pockets, and told herself that her sister had only been caught off guard, that there are situations that make people say things without thinking, that something so small wasn't worth carrying home. She told herself that for the entire ride, and she believed it, right up until tonight. There was one more thing Corinne learned during her 10 years at Beaumont House, and she learned it even faster than she learned how to knead dough or judge the temperature of an oven, and that was never to ask about the 9th floor. The hotel had 9 floors, the elevator had 9 buttons, but the last button only lit up when someone inserted a special card into the slot beside it, and not a single kitchen employee had ever seen the hallway up there. 2 men in black coats always stood near the east elevators, changing shifts at midnight, never speaking to anyone, never eating in the employee cafeteria. They would only give Corinne a slight nod when she pushed her cart past them, then return to standing exactly as they had before. The name Fiancé was spoken inside the hotel in a very particular way, always with voices lowered half a step, always with Mr. placed in front of it, and always followed by a quick change of subject. During hurried meals between shifts, people told one another that sometimes the entire 9th floor stayed lit all night, that black cars would sometimes glide into the rear courtyard at 4 o'clock in the morning and disappear before daylight had fully arrived. A young waitress once whispered to Corinne that no one in this city wanted to owe Mr. Fiancé anything, not money, not even a promise, because the people who had done so didn't disappear in the way people usually imagined. It happened much more quietly than that. The whole city simply seemed to turn its back on them at once. Contracts were canceled. Phone calls went unanswered. One door after another closed in their faces, and no one bothered to explain why. Corinne didn't know how much of any of that was true, and how much was fear embroidered through too many mouths. But she understood that the fear itself was real. She could see it in the way Rosalind stopped what she was doing whenever someone mentioned that name, and in the only sentence the older woman had ever said to Corinne about it, that she should do her work and never get curious, because curiosity didn't bring anything good in a place like this. Corinne nodded and listened, because she had never had time for curiosity anyway, and because she believed that the world of people who lived behind doors like those and the world of a night baker would never touch. She believed that until one night in the middle of December, about 3 weeks before the wedding, when she needed to go up to the dry storage room on the ground floor for more vanilla, and chose to take a shortcut through the corridor behind the bar to save a few minutes. It was around 1 o'clock in the morning. The bar was almost empty, with only 2 tables still lit in the farthest corner, and Corinne stopped in the middle of the hallway when she realized that Brandt was sitting at one of them. He was partly turned away from her, facing 2 men she had never seen before, both older than he was, both sitting very still, while he was anything but still. Corinne couldn't hear a single word. The distance was too great, and the background music covered everything, but she saw enough to understand that this wasn't a pleasant meeting. Brandt's voice was sharp. The muscles in his neck were tight, and at one point, he slammed his hand down on the tabletop hard enough to make the small glass jump slightly. One of the other 2 men didn't move at all. He simply pushed a sheet of paper toward Brandt, tapped it twice with one finger, then withdrew his hand. Corinne stood in the darkness of the hallway with the empty tray still cradled in her arms, and she felt something strange rising in her chest. It wasn't exactly suspicion. It was simply the feeling of someone who had just seen a piece that didn't fit the picture she looked at every day. Brandt never saw her. He had never imagined that his fiancée might be standing 20 steps away, wearing an apron, at the exact hour when he believed the whole world was asleep. Corinne stepped back, took another route to the dry storage room, and for the rest of that night, she worked with the image of his hand, striking the table, returning to her mind again and again. The following afternoon, when they were sitting down to eat together, she asked him how the night before had gone. Brandt leaned back in his chair, smiled, and said he had gone home early and eaten something simple, and been asleep by 10 o'clock, because wedding preparations had been exhausting him lately. He said it so smoothly that there wasn't even a moment of hesitation. Corinne looked at him and felt something cold travel down her spine. And then she did exactly what a woman about to be married often does when faced with something she doesn't want to see. She pushed it away. She told herself that perhaps she had mistaken someone else for him. that in dim light everyone could look alike, that maybe it had only been a business meeting he didn't feel like talking about. She poured him more water and changed the subject to the wedding flowers. 3 weeks later, she would learn that she had been right from the very beginning. But about a month before that night at the bar, in the middle of November, there had been another night that Corinne would later understand was the night that changed everything, though at the time she simply thought she had been unlucky with the weather. A snowstorm swept over the city just after midnight, stronger than the forecast had predicted, and by nearly 3 o'clock in the morning, the city announced that all overnight bus routes would be temporarily suspended until the snowplows had cleared the main roads. Corinne stood at the employee entrance looking outside, watching the snow whip sideways through the streetlights in thick white sheets, then turned back inside. She didn't have enough money for a taxi ride in the middle of a storm. She sent Rosalind a message saying she would stay in the kitchen until the buses started running again, then took off her coat, hung it on a hook, and did what she always did whenever she didn't know what else to do. She started cleaning. By then, the entire building had fallen silent, with only the warm yellow light from the basement kitchen spilling into the hallway, and the sound of pots and pans being placed back on their shelves ringing clearly through the quiet. At 3:47 in the morning, she heard footsteps coming down the hallway. They were uneven footsteps, one heavier than the other, and Corinne looked up just as a man appeared in the kitchen doorway. He was tall, wearing a dark coat with unmelted snow still clinging to the shoulders, his black hair wet and pressed against his temples, and his face carried the exhaustion of someone who had just come through something heavy. He stopped when he saw her, apparently not expecting anyone to be in the kitchen. Corinne didn't know who he was either. In her mind, he was simply one of the quiet men who worked somewhere in the building, perhaps a security guard getting off the night shift, perhaps a driver stranded by the storm just as she was, and he looked like someone who hadn't eaten a proper meal in a very long time. So she did what anyone with an ordinary human heart would have done. She asked if he wanted something to eat. He looked at her, and a faint flicker of surprise passed through his eyes, as though it had been a very long time since anyone had asked him such a simple question. Corinne didn't wait for an answer. She turned on the stove, reheated the pot of potato soup left over from dinner, cut several slices of bread and put them in the oven until they were crisp again, poured a cup of hot tea, then set everything in front of him on the long wooden table in the corner of the kitchen, where employees usually sat to eat between shifts. She didn't ask which department he worked in. She didn't ask why he was there at that hour. She didn't become timid, didn't step away from him, didn't call him sir. She simply set the food down, the way one person places food in front of another, on a night that is far too cold, then turned back to wiping down the steel counter. He ate in silence. She didn't disturb that silence either. After a while, when she reached for the towel hanging from a hook, her sleeve slipped upward and revealed the long scar running along her right forearm. He looked at it and asked, only 3 words, "What happened there?" Corinne glanced down at her arm, pulled her sleeve back into place, and answered briefly, "Oven. I was 18. She said it in the voice of someone describing old weather, asking for no sympathy, adding nothing else. He nodded and didn't ask another question. They exchanged a few scattered remarks about the storm, about the buses still not running, about the roads that probably wouldn't be clear until morning. Meaningless little sentences that seemed to matter to no one. But for those few minutes, for the first time in many months, Corinne felt that someone was looking at her as a human being, not as a shadow whose job was to clean things away. Then the quiet was broken. Hurried footsteps came pounding down the hallway, and Preston Ward burst into the kitchen, his face flushed red, his voice booming as he demanded to see a manager immediately, shouting that he had been ringing from his room for 20 minutes and no one had come up, that the hotel was being run like a warehouse. He pointed at Corinne, ordered her to come over, told her to get someone down there. Corinne lowered the towel, but before she could say anything, Preston Ward's eyes slid past her shoulder and landed on the man sitting at the wooden table in the corner of the kitchen. The man didn't stand. He simply set his cup of tea down on the table, very slowly, then raised his eyes and said a single sentence, so quietly that Corinne, standing only a few steps away, couldn't hear all of it. What happened next was something she would never forget. Every trace of Preston Ward's fury collapsed in less than 2 seconds. His face turned deathly pale. The unfinished sentence caught in his throat. His hands began to shake, and he stammered a few broken words of apology before almost running out of the kitchen without daring to look back, even once. Corinne stood motionless in the middle of the kitchen, the damp towel still in her hand, watching the man calmly lift his cup and continue drinking his tea as though nothing had happened. She watched the slight unevenness in his stride when he rose to his feet. She watched the way he folded his napkin and placed it neatly beside the plate, then thanked her in a low, rough voice with something warm hidden beneath it. And the truth slowly began to rise in Corinne's mind like a dark shape emerging from the bottom of deep water. The man whose soup she had reheated, whose bread she had sliced, whose tea she had poured, the man she had treated with a kindness that expected absolutely nothing in return, was Emery Ferrante. Brant Whitlock entered Corinne's life 4 months earlier. On a late summer evening when the hotel was hosting a client appreciation dinner for a real estate company, and the pastry kitchen had to work an extra shift to supply the dessert station, she pushed her cart into the banquet hall, and he was the only person among more than 100 people there who stopped and asked her name. He complimented the almond cake, asked how long she had been doing this work, and when she said 10 years, he gave a soft whistle and told her that 10 years of night shifts was too much for a 27-year-old woman. No one had ever said that to her before. In 10 years, not one person had ever looked at the hours she worked and called them too much. 3 weeks later, he came back looking for her, and 3 weeks after that, she was sitting in his car at 6 o'clock in the morning, instead of standing at the bus stop, waiting for the 6:15 bus. He spoke smoothly, laughed easily, knew how to make other people feel important, and he made promises. He promised that after they were married, she wouldn't have to work nights anymore, that her hands had already given enough for 10 years, that he would take care of everything. He made promises about Ezra too, saying he knew a few people, that she should leave the transplant expenses to him, that her younger brother would get well and go back to school. Corinne believed those promises the way a drowning person believes in a plank of wood drifting within reach, not because the plank is certain to hold, but because it is the only thing close enough to grasp. It wasn't until they began planning the wedding that she started to see him change. She wanted a small ceremony, a few dozen people, somewhere in a restaurant near the hospital so it would be easier to bring Ezra. Brant dismissed the idea immediately. He said it had to be Beaumont House. It had to be the grand ballroom. There had to be screens broadcasting the ceremony live. And the guest list he gave her contained 180 people, fewer than 20 of whose names Corinne even recognized. The rest were clients, developers, people he needed to meet. He said a wedding was an opportunity too, that people trusted a man with a stable family more when it came time to sign large contracts. And he said it so casually that Corinne didn't have time to realize what she had just heard. Adeline threw herself into the preparations from the very first day. She called Corinne 2 or 3 times every week, sent photographs of floral arrangements, sent links to bridal shops, made the menu tasting appointment herself, handled the hotel event coordinator herself. Every time Corinne said she could take care of things on her own, Adeline laughed and gave the same answer. "Let me handle everything for you. You work all night. Where would you find the strength?" One evening, when Corinne was so exhausted that she had fallen asleep with her head on the dining table, her sister rested a hand on her shoulder and said that for 10 years Corinne had carried everything, so this time she should let Adeline do something for her. Corinne had cried because of those words. She remembered crying, and she remembered the strange relief of allowing someone else to take part of her burden for the first time in her life. There was only one thing, in the middle of all of it, that felt slightly strange. Brant kept asking about the old house. The first time was over dinner, when he casually asked whether her parents' house was still standing after the fire or whether it had been torn down. Corinne told him it was still there, but it had been sealed. The second time was in the car, when he asked who had the property documents. She said her sister did, because back then Adeline had been the one legally responsible for managing the estate. The third time, he asked more specifically whether any of the 3 siblings had ever signed anything related to the house, and his voice was still light, still casual, but he waited for her answer a little longer than necessary. Corinne said she had never signed anything, that she had only been 17 at the time, that Adeline had handled all the paperwork, and that her sister had said the house had been sealed since the fire. No one could enter it. No one could sell it. Brant nodded and said, "Yeah, that's a shame. Land in that area is worth a lot now," then changed the subject. Corinne didn't think anything more of it. She hadn't set foot on that street in 10 years, and in her mind, the house had become nothing more than a sealed black shape she had no desire to look at again. She already had too much to worry about. A shift every night, a waiting list to check every month, a wedding she didn't truly want but had agreed to because people told her it was the door to an easier life. So she put that question away, along with the image of Brant's hand striking the table at the bar, along with the sentence her sister had spoken in the grand lobby that night. 3 small pieces, 3 moments when she could have stopped and looked more closely, 3 times she chose to believe. Corinne left the hospital just as the sky was beginning to brighten and drove straight to Beaumont House, and she realized something almost funny. that for 10 years she had always entered this building through the employee door at the back, but today she walked in through the front entrance. At 7 o'clock in the morning, the grand ballroom was in the middle of the chaos of preparation. People were spreading tablecloths, arranging chairs in perfectly straight rows, building the floral arch over the ceremony platform, running electrical cables along the base of the walls. No one paid any attention to her. In a kitchen apron, she had always been invisible, and this morning, in a heavy coat with her hair tied up in a hurry, she was just as invisible. She stood at the edge of the ballroom for a while, watching the large projection screen installed behind the ceremony platform as it went through its test sequence, images lighting up and disappearing, and she remembered what Brandt had said when he insisted on having it. He had said that even the guests in the last row needed to see the bride and groom clearly, that if people had made the effort to come, they deserved to see everything properly. Corinne stood there and thought that he had been right. Today, every one of them was going to see very clearly. The young technician in charge of the sound and video system was sitting behind a control table in the right corner of the ballroom, wearing a headset over one ear, drinking coffee while checking the list of files scheduled to play during the ceremony. Corinne walked over, introduced herself as the bride, and he immediately stood up, a little flustered, asking if she needed anything changed. She said she had a video she wanted added. She took the small USB drive from her coat pocket, placed it on the control table, and said it was a surprise thank you for her sister, the person who had taken care of the entire wedding from beginning to end. She said it in a calm voice, neither fast nor slow, and she heard herself speaking without blinking once. The technician smiled and said it was a great idea, that lately everyone seemed to be doing little surprises like that at weddings. Corinne nodded and added only one thing, that she wanted to choose the exact moment when it would be shown. He looked up slightly and asked when she was thinking. After the rings, or during the reception. She said she wasn't sure yet, that something like this had to happen at exactly the right moment if it was going to be moving. So whenever she nodded toward him, he should press play. The technician shrugged, plugged the USB drive into the computer, dragged the file into the waiting list, placed it on the very last line, and told her not to worry. He would keep his finger ready on the button. All she had to do was give him the signal. He didn't open the file to watch it. He didn't ask another question. To him, she was simply a kind-hearted bride who wanted to surprise her sister, and in the entire building that morning, nothing could have seemed more ordinary. Corinne thanked him, turned away, and only after taking several steps did she realize that both of her hands were clenched tightly inside her coat pockets. She walked slowly down the aisle between the 2 rows of chairs being arranged, counting them without meaning to, and stopped at the first row, where a small card rested against the back of one chair, with her sister's name written on it. She looked at that name for a long time. Then she raised her eyes and took in the whole ballroom, the speakers mounted on both sides, the small microphone that would be clipped to the groom's lapel so that every word of the vows could reach the last row, the white floral arch still being assembled, and the enormous screen behind the ceremony platform still running its tests. Brandt had arranged every bit of it himself. He had borrowed money, calculated every detail, argued with the event coordinator for weeks to get it all so that 180 people who mattered to his career could see the image of a trustworthy man. He had built a stage to honor himself, and Corinne stood in the middle of that stage at 7 o'clock in the morning, with a USB drive already sitting inside the system, and understood that he had prepared the perfect auditorium for her with his own hands, a place where the truth would be spoken loudly enough and clearly enough that afterward, not one of them would ever be able to pretend they hadn't heard it. She pulled her collar higher around her neck and headed toward the service elevator, the familiar route she had taken for 10 years, to go up to the bridal room on the floor above. The bridal room on the 4th floor was filled with sunlight and laughter, and during the 2 hours Corinne sat in front of the mirror, she spoke no more than 10 sentences. Her 3 bridesmaids were old friends from high school, women who still believed she was lucky, who still believed today was the day life was finally rewarding her after 10 years of hardship, and they crowded around her with combs, makeup cases, and jokes about the wedding night. One curled her hair into soft waves. Another brushed blush across her cheeks to hide the pallor left by a sleepless night. Corinne let those hands work over her face and stared into the mirror as though she were looking at a stranger. And she thought that only 24 hours earlier, the face reflected there had still been innocent enough to believe. Adeline came in close to 11 o'clock, wearing the wine-red dress she had chosen 3 months earlier, and the whole room seemed to brighten when she entered. She walked straight behind her younger sister, rested both hands on Corinne's shoulders, then carefully adjusted a strand of hair that had fallen out of place near her temple, exactly the way she had done since Corinne was a little girl. Her eyes were shining with tears in the mirror. She said she had waited a very long time for this day, that Corinne deserved this happiness more than anyone in the world, that starting today she wouldn't have to carry anything anymore. All three bridesmaids let out soft cries of emotion at once. Corinne looked directly into those eyes in the mirror, and for the first time in 27 years, she saw the entire performance. She saw the tear timed perfectly, the tilt of the head, the carefully measured pause before the word happiness. She had lived inside that performance her entire life, without ever realizing she had been sitting in the audience. She smiled and said thank you, and her voice sounded so normal that even she found it strange. Then the door opened, and Brant walked in. The bridesmaids shrieked and tried to chase him out, saying the groom wasn't supposed to see the bride before the ceremony. But he laughed, raised his hands in apology, and said he only needed 1 minute. He was carrying a folder with a blue cover. He walked over to the vanity, set the folder down, took out a pen, and said these were just some bank papers for their joint loan that the broker needed before the end of the week. Nothing but paperwork. Better to sign them now and get it over with so it wouldn't interfere with their trip next week. He turned to the last page, folded the pages above it back, exposing only a single blank signature line, then handed her the pen. Corinne took it. She looked down at the page, and she saw the folded section above, saw the edges of numbers hidden from view, saw the name of a bank she had never done business with. Her hand stopped halfway, the tip of the pen about 1 finger joint above the paper. She placed the pen back on the table and said later. Something in the room changed slightly, so slightly that none of the 3 bridesmaids noticed. Brant was still smiling, but he said it again, asking what was the big deal. It would take 5 seconds to sign her name, and if they left it for later, they might forget. Corinne looked up at him, and she could see very clearly that his mouth was smiling but his eyes weren't. She said her hand was shaking today, and her signature would look terrible, so she would sign it properly tomorrow. There was a silence that lasted exactly 2 beats. Then Brant laughed, gathered the folder back up, said sure, that was fine, kissed her forehead, and walked out. Corinne remained seated, watching the door close, and felt something shift inside her chest, because in 4 months he had never once mentioned any joint loan. Near noon, everyone went downstairs. Corinne stopped at the foot of the staircase leading into the ballroom, holding her wedding bouquet in both hands, and Adeline was waiting there alone. Her sister wrapped her arms around her and held her very tightly, and in that embrace was all the familiar warmth Corinne had known for 27 years. Adeline whispered into her ear, reminding her of that night 10 years earlier when the 2 sisters had sat on plastic chairs outside a hospital hallway from evening until morning. When Corinne was 17 and had no idea what she was supposed to do with the rest of her life, Adeline said that night she had promised herself she would never let Corinne suffer again. She said today was the day that promise finally came true. Corinne stood still in her sister's arms, her face turned toward the ballroom doors, and she felt her heart being torn in 2. One half wanted to collapse against Adeline's shoulder and cry the way she had when she was little, because the woman holding her was also the woman who had sat beside her all through that night. The other half went cold when she remembered the words lying silently inside the bouquet only a few inches away. When Adeline released her, Corinne looked directly into her sister's face, searching for some trace, some hesitation, a blink that came half a beat too late. Anything that would allow her to believe last night had only been a nightmare. There was nothing. Adeline simply smiled, radiant and whole, perfect until the very last second, then reached out and smoothed a crease from her sister's wedding dress. Inside the ballroom, the piano began to play. The first image filled the screen nearly 4 meters high behind the ceremony platform, and for the first 2 seconds, the entire ballroom was still smiling because everyone expected to see an old childhood photograph of the bride. Then the words appeared, enlarged enough that even the people in the last row could read every single period. I can't sleep. I keep thinking about last night. I don't know how I'm supposed to stand there tomorrow, Addie. Beneath it was the timestamp. 3:32 this morning. The laughter didn't disappear all at once. It faded from the front rows toward the back, spreading like a crack racing across the surface of ice. Corinne stood perfectly still beside the ceremony platform, still holding her bouquet. And she didn't turn to look at the screen because she already knew every line by heart. The second image, the third, one message after another, arranged in the exact chronological order she had created in the hospital hallway at 5 o'clock that morning, moving backward through the weeks, through 4 months. By the 7th image, someone in the ballroom had already cried out without meaning to, and by the 9th, The only sound left in the entire room was the hum of the projector. Then the screen changed to the family joint account statement, the balance dropping month by month like a descending slope, and beside it appeared the transplant program payment record, with the final 3 entries, all carrying the same word: unpaid, 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 along with the notes about the 2 reminder letters that had been sent, and the receiving address displayed in unmistakable detail. That was when Brant rushed onto the platform. He grabbed the microphone from its stand, turned toward the crowd, and his voice broke into a shout as he said she was crazy, that this was the work of a jealous, delusional woman, that she had fabricated everything to destroy the happiest day of his life. He spread his arms toward the important guests he had invited, his face twisting as he tried to hold together the image that was already cracking apart. Corinne didn't step back. She took out her phone, held it up beside the screen, and said calmly that if anyone had doubts, they could look carefully at the timestamp in the upper right corner of every photograph. Every one of them matched the call and message history on her sister's phone, and anyone who wanted to verify it could ask the phone carrier to confirm the records. She didn't raise her voice, but the microphone clipped to the groom's lapel was still less than 3 feet from her, and it caught every word and carried it through the speakers on both sides of the ballroom. Brant fell silent. Then the final image appeared. Corinne looked up too, because this was the image she had never opened, the one she had photographed in a panic the night before stopping at the 11th image because she couldn't bear to look any further. On the screen was a photograph of a mortgage loan file. The amount was $380,000. The collateral was the address of the house she had believed for 10 years had been sealed after the fire. On the 3rd line of the signature page, beneath the section marked co-owner, was a signature bearing the name Corinne Halloway, written in a hand she had never used in her life. And directly beneath it, neatly stamped, was the notary seal along with the confirming signature of attorney Adeline Halloway. Corinne stood frozen in the middle of the ceremony platform. In that moment, she couldn't hear anything anymore. She couldn't hear the sharp breath spreading through the ballroom. She couldn't hear the sound of a wine glass falling somewhere among the tables. She was too busy understanding something she hadn't understood until that very second. That what had happened to her hadn't begun 4 months ago, and it hadn't begun with an affair. It had begun 10 years earlier, and she had been living inside it for an entire decade without ever knowing. The whole ballroom broke apart at once. People shot to their feet. People turned toward one another. Someone shouted Adeline's name. In the front row, the woman in the wine-red dress made it halfway to her feet before both hands clamped onto the back of the chair in front of her. Her knees buckled, and she couldn't say a single word. She didn't deny it. She didn't argue. She didn't beg. The relatives seated around her moved away on both sides as though recoiling from a fire. Corinne turned and looked at Brant, looked at the microphone still in his hand, then reached down and removed the engagement ring from her ring finger. She placed it on the small table beside the ceremony platform, set her wedding bouquet next to it, and the 2 things lay there side by side, looking very neat, very final, more final than anything words could have expressed. Then she stepped toward the microphone and spoke one last time, her voice no louder than it had been at the beginning, saying that she hadn't come there today to become anyone's wife, but to make sure that everyone in that room could see the true faces of the 2 people they had come there to bless. There was one thing Brant Whitlock couldn't endure in that moment, and it wasn't what was being shown on the screen, and it wasn't the 180 pairs of eyes watching him. It was the fact that the woman standing 2 steps away from him wasn't trembling at all. She wasn't crying. She wasn't raising her voice. She placed the ring on the table with the same steady hand she used when carrying a tray of hot pastries out of the oven, and she looked at him with a calmness that made him feel smaller. The mask he had worn for 4 months fell away completely, and what appeared beneath it was the true face of a man who only knew how to blame and punish other people for his own sins. He began to speak, and there was no sweetness left in his voice. It was shrill and poisonous, carried by the microphone clipped to his lapel all the way to the last row. He said who was she to stand there and judge him? He said she was nothing but a little night shift baker, someone who had spent 10 years hiding in the basement of this hotel, someone whose entire life was flour and ovens, and who had never stepped into a room unless someone was paying her to clean it. He pointed at her arm and said, "Look at those hands, cracked, calloused, covered in scars. That no decent man in this world would ever bother looking twice at a woman like her, that he had lowered himself to choose her, and this was how she repaid him." The entire ballroom went silent before the naked cruelty of it. Several women raised their hands to cover their mouths. Several men frowned and turned their faces away, but not one person stood up. Corinne remained still and took in every word, her expression unchanged, and that very calmness only poured more fuel onto the fire, consuming him from within. He needed to see her collapse. He needed to see her beg, needed to see her cry, because only by watching her break could he still believe he was greater than she was. And when she refused to give him that, the last thing holding him back snapped. He stepped toward her, grabbed her right wrist and squeezed hard, directly over the arm with the scar, then jerked her closer until his face was only inches from hers. His breath came hot and fast, through clenched teeth, softly enough that the microphone wouldn't catch it, but clearly enough that she heard every word. He told her she would pay for this, that he would make sure she couldn't hold her head up in this city for even one more day, that he would come after her workplace, her brother's hospital, every place she ever set foot. Pain shot through Corinne's wrist beneath his grip, but she didn't cry out. She didn't struggle. She only looked straight into the bloodshot eyes of the man who had once promised to take care of her for the rest of her life. And in that moment, she understood something colder than fear. She was completely alone. 180 people were sitting there, old friends from high school, relatives who had eaten meals in her home, the 3 bridesmaids who had been laughing with her only 2 hours earlier, the sister now crumpled in the front row. Every one of them could see what was happening, and every one of them remained seated. The crowd Brandt had invited to admire his glory had become nothing more than a motionless audience, watching a performance slide toward a place no one wanted it to go. Corinne felt real fear rising in her chest. Not the fear of humiliation or losing her future, but the primitive fear of someone weaker being cornered by someone stronger. The kind of fear she had known too well throughout a lifetime spent lowering her head. She tried to pull her hand free. His grip only tightened. And at the exact moment when everything seemed ready to slip beyond control, while Brandt's twisted face was still pressed close to hers with all the menace of a man who believed he had nothing left to lose, a voice came from behind him. It wasn't loud, it wasn't hurried, but it was so calm that it sent a chill down the spine of everyone sitting in the ballroom, and the hand gripping Corinne's wrist froze in place. Let go of her. That was all. Not one unnecessary word. Not the slightest trace of anger in his voice, so quiet that the people sitting in the last row had to hold their breath to hear it clearly. And yet that sentence still moved through the ballroom, like a current of cold air sinking into the marrow of everyone seated there. Brandt spun around, ready to unleash his fury on whoever had dared interfere. But the instant his eyes met the face of the man in the dark coat, every trace of aggression vanished from him like snow meeting fire. He recognized that face. He recognized the name this entire city only dared speak in lowered voices, and in a single second, all the blood seemed to drain from his face. The hand gripping Corinne's wrist immediately loosened, trembling as though it had just touched something burning hot. Emery Ferrante didn't take another step forward. He didn't raise a hand. He didn't raise his voice. He simply stood there about 10 steps from the ceremony platform, both hands still inside the pockets of his coat, his cold gray eyes, hard as steel, fixed directly on Brandt, and that absolute stillness was more frightening than any threat shouted aloud. He continued, slowly, every word clear, saying that a real man never needed to use force against a woman to prove anything. He said that what Brandt had just exposed in front of 180 people in that room wasn't strength, but the deepest cowardice of a small and ordinary man. Every sentence Emery spoke was calm and clear, yet each one cut into Brandt more deeply than any blade could have, because everyone in the ballroom knew that the man speaking was someone capable of turning every word into reality. Brandt stammered something, trying to salvage the last scrap of his dignity, but his voice had already broken and barely formed a sound. Emery merely tilted his head slightly toward the large doors at the far end of the ballroom, where 2 men in black coats had somehow been standing without anyone noticing when they arrived. It was only that small gesture. Brandt fell silent, took 1 step backward, then another, his face deathly pale, while the entire ballroom watched in absolute silence. 180 people, witnessing the man who only moments earlier had been shouting and making threats, now shrink into himself like a child caught in the act. And every one of them understood that the balance of power in that room had completely reversed in only a few short seconds. Only then did Emery take his eyes off Brandt, and when he turned to Corinne, all the coldness in his face softened in a strange, almost imperceptible way, as though someone had quietly lowered the temperature of the entire room. He walked over to her, took off his dark coat, and draped it over her trembling shoulders, a gesture so simple that Corinne's throat tightened. Then he asked if she was all right. He asked in the same low, warm voice she had heard in the basement kitchen on the night of the snowstorm, when he had still been nothing more than a stranger sitting at a table eating a reheated bowl of potato soup. And in that moment, Corinne suddenly understood something that nearly made her cry. that the man this entire city feared was the only person among the 180 people there that day who had stepped forward to stand beside her. She couldn't speak. She only gave a small nod. Emery held out his hand. He didn't take hers. He didn't pull her away. He didn't order her to do anything. He simply held his hand out and left it there, like a silent invitation telling her that she didn't have to remain in this place for even one more second, and that whether she walked away or stayed was still entirely her choice. Corinne looked at that hand. Then she placed her calloused hand into his palm, and for the first time in all 27 years of her life, she understood what it felt like to be protected, what it felt like to stand behind someone instead of always having to hold everything up alone. The two of them stepped down from the ceremony platform and walked between the rows of chairs. They passed stunned faces whose mouths still hadn't closed, past the 3 bridesmaids standing motionless, past the woman in the wine-red dress still crumpled in the front row with both hands gripping the back of the chair in front of her, past the man who had just been stripped of every trace of power and could do nothing now but watch them leave. No one said a word. No one dared stop them. And when the great wooden doors at the end of the ballroom closed behind them, Corinne left behind not only a wedding that had fallen apart, but an entire life of lowering her head and enduring in silence, a life she had lived for far too long. That night, after Emery's driver took her all the way home and waited until the light inside came on before pulling away, Corinne stepped into the cramped studio apartment near the hotel and stood for a long time in the familiar darkness, still wearing the dark coat over her shoulders, still dressed in the wedding gown that had become nothing more than a meaningless white shell. She turned on the light. The weak yellow glow fell across everything that remained of a life she had once believed was about to begin a new chapter. The wedding gifts her friends had sent the week before were still stacked neatly on the table against the wall, their wrapping paper still sparkling, none of them opened. Corinne took off the wedding dress, folded it carefully, placed it on the chair in the corner, and her hands were still steady, her face still calm, just as they had been throughout the terrible day that had just passed. She had held on to that calm in front of 180 people. She had kept her back straight, while line after line of betrayal appeared on the screen. She hadn't shed a single tear while being humiliated in the middle of the ballroom. But now, when she was finally alone in the silent room, when there was no one left in front of whom she had to be strong, no stage left on which to perform, no eyes watching her, the armor she had forced herself to hold together since 3:47 the previous morning finally began to crack. She sat down on the edge of the bed, her calloused hands resting on her knees, staring into the empty space in front of her, where tonight was supposed to have been the first night of a new life. Then the tears began to fall, slowly at first, like a dam that had held back too much for too many years and had finally broken. She didn't cry because she had lost Brant, because she understood there had never been anything precious in that man worth losing. She cried for herself. She cried for the 17-year-old girl sitting in the administrative office of her high school, picking up a pen with her own hand and writing her name on the withdrawal form, believing she was doing the right thing. She cried for 10 years of night shifts, for the mornings spent waiting for the 6:15 bus with cracked hands hidden inside her coat pockets, for every Christmas when she took extra shifts because she needed the money, for the hands that had grown old before the rest of her had. She cried for the sister she had sacrificed her entire youth to support, the sister she had just lost, not to death, but to something far more painful than death. Sobs tore from her chest, one after another, impossible to hold back. And she let them come, because she knew this was what she needed, because no one can stay strong forever without being allowed to collapse at least once. She cried until there were no tears left, until exhaustion pulled her into a restless sleep right there on the small bed. In the days that followed, everything began to come down, and Corinne learned about it not from the news but from Rosalind, who came to the studio apartment carrying a box of pastries and stayed to talk with her for the entire afternoon. She said the whole city was talking, that the phone video recorded inside the ballroom that day had spread everywhere in less than 2 days. Brant Whitlock was placed under criminal investigation for forging a signature and using falsified notarized documents to obtain a mortgage loan. His real estate brokerage license was revoked within the week. His pending contracts were canceled one after another, and the developers who had shaken his hand in that very ballroom now avoided him as though he carried a contagious disease. The banks called in his old loans all at once without negotiating a single word. No one answered his calls anymore. The city he had once believed he could walk through with his head held high, the city where he had invited 180 people to witness his glory, now turned its back on him all at once, with a coldness so complete it was almost cruel. As for Adeline, The state bar suspended her license to practice almost immediately after her notarization records were submitted. Her law firm dismissed her within 3 days. She had no income left, couldn't afford the rent, and by the end of that month she had to move out of the apartment that was still in Corinne's name, carrying 2 suitcases with her to a small rented room on the south side of the city. When Rosalind finished telling her everything, she sat quietly for a while and then asked Corinne whether she felt any lighter. Corinne looked down at her hands for a long time, and she realized she didn't feel triumphant, didn't feel pleased, didn't feel anything that resembled victory. She only felt a strange quiet, as though someone had finally put everything back where it belonged. But that quiet lasted exactly 11 days. The investigation into the mortgage loan forced people to reopen the entire property record connected to the 3 Holloway siblings, and when the investigator's attorney sent Corinne copies of the relevant documents so she could verify the signatures, she sat down at the dining table in her studio apartment and opened the envelope, believing she would only need to confirm a few signatures and be done with it. She reached the 4th page and stopped. It was an extract from an insurance file dated nearly 10 years earlier, and in the dry, precise language of official paperwork, it stated very clearly that the claim for fire damage to the house at that address had been approved and paid in full, in a single payment, to the legal administrator of the estate, Adeline Holloway. Beneath that was the date of the transfer. Beneath that was the signature confirming receipt. Corinne read it 3 times. Then, she turned to the next page, and there was the property's transaction history, and she saw something she hadn't considered for even a single second in the past 10 years of her life. The house had never been sealed. It had never been closed off. Never been declared off limits. 6 months after the fire, it had been repaired using that very insurance payment. And from then until now, for nearly 10 years, it had been rented continuously, one lease after another, without a single month of interruption, with the rent deposited regularly into an account under the name of the estate administrator. Corinne set the paper down on the table and sat completely still for a very long time. There was no rage in her mind then, no scream, only one very small question repeating itself again and again. So what had she been staying awake all those nights for? She remembered the afternoon 10 years earlier, when Adeline came home from the insurance office looking exhausted, sat down beside her 2 younger siblings, and told them their claim had been denied, that the company had cited incomplete paperwork, that the house had been sealed, and no one was allowed inside anymore, and that from then on, the 3 of them would have to take care of themselves. Corinne remembered sitting there silently at 17, listening to those words, and she remembered the cold feeling running down her spine when she understood that there was nothing left. 3 days later, she signed the withdrawal form and left school. Now, at 27, she sat in the cramped studio apartment, staring at proof that those words had been a lie, and she realized that her entire adult life had been built on that one lie. That afternoon, Corinne got into her car and drove to the address she hadn't visited in 10 years. She remembered the way with a strange clarity, every turn, even the street lamp at the end of the block where she used to lean and wait for her father to come home from work when she was a child. She parked across the street, turned off the engine, and looked up. The house was still there. The roof had been replaced. The walls were painted a different color. The wooden fence had been renewed, and a child's bicycle leaned against the front steps. A light was on in the first-floor window. Corinne could see shadows moving behind the curtains, could see warm golden light spilling into the front yard, and she understood that another family was inside that house, eating their dinner. She sat in the car for a long time, both hands resting on the steering wheel, neither crying nor saying a word. She thought about 10 years of night shifts. She thought about the mornings when she fell asleep on the bus with a box of pastries on her lap. She thought about the year Ezra came down with pneumonia, and she worked 18 shifts in a row without a single day off, so she could pay the hospital bills. She thought about all the times her sister had called and said she was busy, that Corinne just needed to keep going a little longer, that she would make it up to her someday. And she thought about the apartment still in Corinne's name, the apartment Corinne had continued paying for throughout those 10 years, where her sister had moved in temporarily 2 years earlier and never left, while their parents' house was still standing here with its lights on, bringing in rent every month, not 1 cent of which Corinne had ever seen. Inside the house, a child ran past the window laughing, and the sound of that laughter carried all the way out to the street. Corinne heard it, and found herself smiling too. A sad smile, but a sincere one, because at least someone was still living happily inside that house. At least it hadn't been abandoned the way she had believed for 10 years. She sat there a little longer, then started the engine, and drove away without looking back. On the way home, She understood one thing clearly. What hurt most wasn't the money, and it wasn't the house. It was those 10 years. 10 years no one could ever give back to her. 3 days later, Corinne received a message inviting her up to the 9th floor, and she took the east elevator with the card handed to her by a man in a black coat, watching the final button light up for the first time in 10 years. The 9th floor was nothing like anything she had ever imagined. There was nothing mysterious about it. Only a long hallway lined with several wooden doors and a large room at the far end overlooking the harbor. Emery stood when she entered. He came straight to the point without any preamble. He said he had ordered his people to review every debt in her name after the mortgage file came to light, that he could have all of it cleared within a week, and that he would also cover every expense connected to Ezra's transplant program, from the evaluation fee and lodging costs to the medication he would need afterward. He said it as calmly as if he were talking about the weather, and to him, perhaps it truly was that simple. Corinne stood still and listened until he finished. Then she said no. He looked up at her. She said she was grateful that he had stepped forward that day, that she would remember it for the rest of her life, but she wouldn't accept this money. She said that for the past 10 years, there had already been someone who claimed to take care of everything for her, and she had spent 10 years being grateful to that person, only to discover that she had paid for that gratitude with her entire youth. She said she didn't need anyone to save her anymore. She needed to be able to stand. She said that if he paid everything off now, she would end up right back where she had been before, in the place of someone who owed another person something, and she didn't want to spend one more day of her life in that place. Emery was silent for quite a while after she finished. Then he nodded once and said all right. He didn't insist. He didn't try to persuade her. He didn't look offended. And only later, when Corinne looked back on that moment, did she understand that this was the point when that man truly began to respect her. But she didn't leave. She said she still had one question. She asked why he had been in the ballroom that day. She said she had been thinking about it for 2 weeks, that his name wasn't on the guest list, that in all 10 years she had worked there he had never attended a single employee wedding, and that he had walked in at the exact minute when she needed someone to walk in. She said she didn't believe in coincidence. Emery turned toward the window and looked down at the harbor, and then he told her. He said that 3 weeks before the wedding, while reviewing a separate real estate transaction on the north side, one of his people had discovered a mortgage file that showed signs of irregularity, and the name listed on the co-owner line was hers. He said he had known 3 weeks before she did. Corinne felt as though the floor shifted beneath her feet. He continued, saying that on the night before the wedding, he had Gideon deliver a single sentence to Brant Whitlock, that the file was under review. One sentence. He didn't threaten him, didn't set conditions, didn't demand anything. He simply dropped a stone into the water and stood back to watch. And what happened afterward was easy enough for anyone to guess. Brant panicked and left the apartment shortly before 3 o'clock in the morning, forgetting his gray wool coat over the back of a chair. At 3:32, he sent Adeline a message. And Adeline, a woman who never let her phone out of her hand, read that message in the kitchen that night, paced around the table, then set the phone down on the counter, and went into another room to look for the file. 15 minutes later, her younger sister came downstairs to pour herself a glass of water. Corinne stood frozen. Then she became angry, and for the first time in this entire story, she was truly angry with someone. She said he had known for 3 weeks and had stayed silent. She said that night had been the most painful night of her life, that she had stood in that kitchen feeling as though her entire world was collapsing. And while she stood there, it turned out she had been standing inside someone else's move on a chessboard. She asked whether it had ever occurred to him that he could have simply picked up the phone and called her, that he could have told her one sentence, so she wouldn't have had to discover the truth alone in such a terrible way. Emery didn't defend himself. He didn't say he had done it for her. He didn't say he had thought about it carefully. He only turned back to look at her, and said that if he had called her, she wouldn't have believed him, and if she had believed him, then she would have felt indebted to him for the rest of her life. He said he didn't want to be the person who placed the truth into her hands. He only wanted the truth to be within her reach, and everything after that had to remain her choice. Corinne looked at him for a very long time. Then she turned and walked out of the room, down the hallway, into the elevator, and out of the building without saying goodbye. 3 days later, during the break between shifts, Rosalind Pike sat down at the long wooden table in the corner of the kitchen, placed a cup of hot tea in front of Corinne just as she had done for 10 years, and said there was something she thought Corinne should know. She said everyone in the hotel knew, but no one ever spoke about it, partly out of respect and partly out of fear. Then she told her. Rosalind said she had started working there when the building still had another name, back when it was a mid-range hotel with its laundry department located in the west basement. In those days, there was a woman who worked the night shift in the laundry room, an Italian woman who spoke very little and worked with great care, and she had a young son who often sat waiting for his mother in the corner of the hallway until her shift ended. Rosalind said she still remembered that boy because he was so well behaved and so quiet. The woman worked there for nearly 10 years, and during her final year she gradually became ill, but she still showed up for every shift because she was afraid that if she missed too many days, someone else would replace her. Then one night near the end of winter, she collapsed in the middle of her shift. They took her to the hospital. Rosalind paused for a while, then continued in the same even voice, saying that under the hospital rules at the time, her admission required an upfront deposit before she could be transferred to a treatment unit, and she didn't have health insurance through the hotel because she was classified as a temporary worker. She and her son didn't have the money. She was placed in the hallway to wait while her case was reviewed. Rosalind said she didn't know how long that night lasted, only that by 3:47 in the morning, it was over, and the hotel received the news at the beginning of the next shift. Rosalind stopped there and didn't say anything more about that night. She only said the boy had been 11 years old. Corinne sat motionless, both hands wrapped around the cup of tea that had already gone cold. Rosalind continued, saying that after that, no one heard anything about the boy for many years. Then, 19 years later, the building changed ownership, was renamed Beaumont House, and the man who bought it was a 30-year-old named Fiancé. Rosalind said the first thing he did after taking over was provide full health insurance for every employee, including temporary workers, including dishwashers, and the second thing he did was tear out the entire old laundry area in the west basement and rebuild it as a break room and cafeteria for the night staff. She said that through all the years since then, he had never once explained why, and no one had ever been brave enough to ask. Corinne sat there for a long time after Rosalind returned to her work. She thought about the employee break room where she had eaten thousands of meals over the past 10 years, without ever wondering what had once been there. She thought about the night of the snowstorm, when she reheated a pot of potato soup for a stranger and didn't ask him a single question. And she understood that on that night, the man sitting at that table hadn't seen a night shift baker. He had seen another woman, in another basement, many years earlier. That afternoon, Corinne went up to the 9th floor for the second time without announcing herself. Emery didn't seem surprised. He simply stood and pulled out a chair for her. They sat across from each other, and neither of them mentioned their previous conversation. Neither apologized, neither explained anything. Then Emery opened a desk drawer, took out a small, worn box, and placed it in front of her. Corinne opened it and went completely still. Inside was her mother's silver wedding ring. It was the only thing that had survived the fire. The one possession Corinne had kept for 7 years before selling it 3 years earlier. During the month, Ezra had to be rushed to the hospital and she couldn't find the money anywhere else. She had stood outside the pawn shop for a long time that day before walking inside, and she had accepted that she would never see the ring again. She asked him how he had found it. Emery said he had his people trace the records of pawn shops across the city from 3 years earlier, and they found the exact transaction. Then he paused for a moment and said there was something else he wasn't sure she wanted to hear. Corinne told him to say it. He said the ring hadn't remained at the pawn shop. It had been redeemed 2 weeks later, and the person who redeemed it was Adeline Halloway. Corinne looked up. Emery continued, saying that for the past 3 years, the ring had been sitting inside a box in her sister's desk drawer, in the apartment that was still in Corinne's name, and whose rent Corinne herself had been paying. Her sister had bought it back. Her sister had kept it for 3 years, and in all those 3 years, not once had she found the courage to place it back into her younger sister's hand. The call came close to 1 o'clock in the morning, cutting through Corinne's restless sleep with the ringing sound she had dreaded for 2 years. The overnight staff member at the transplant center said Ezra had deteriorated during his evening dialysis session, that his blood pressure had dropped, his numbers were worsening quickly, and they were moving him to the emergency unit. Corinne sprang out of bed, her hands shaking so badly that she couldn't even fasten the buttons on her clothes, and in that panic, the first person she thought of, the only person she called, was Emery Ferrante. He answered on the very first ring, even though it was the middle of the night. He didn't ask why she was calling. He didn't ask why it was at this hour. 15 minutes later, his car was already parked outside her studio apartment, the headlights cutting through the darkness of the narrow street, and he simply opened the car door for her and drove away with the calmness of a man who understood that in moments like this, what another person needed wasn't comforting words, but action. Throughout the entire drive, Corinne sat curled into herself in the passenger seat, both hands clenched tightly together, and Emery rested one hand on her shoulder without saying anything. By the time they arrived, Ezra had already been wheeled through a set of doors she wasn't allowed to cross, and she was left standing in the cold hospital hallway with that familiar sense of helplessness that made her feel sick. Near 3 o'clock in the morning, Corinne heard footsteps at the far end of the hallway and looked up. Adeline was standing there. She looked painfully thin compared with the last time Corinne had seen her in the front row of the ballroom, her hair tied back in a hurry, an old coat wrapped around her body, an envelope in one hand. There was no wine-red dress now, no leather briefcase, nothing at all. She stopped several steps away from her younger sister and didn't dare come any closer. Then she held out the envelope and said she had received the test results that afternoon. She said she was a match. Corinne stared at the envelope in her hand for a long time without reaching for it. Then she asked one question, her voice rough from a night without sleep. Why only now? She said Ezra had been waiting for 2 years. She said that throughout those 2 years, Adeline had still been there, still walking through the same apartment, still eating at the same table, and not once had she mentioned getting tested. Adeline stood motionless. Then she said something that Corinne would later understand was the first, truly honest confession her sister had made to her in 10 years. She said she hadn't dared to go, not because she was afraid of pain, not because she was afraid of surgery, not because of anything a person could admit without feeling ashamed. She said she was afraid the result would show that she was a match, because as long as she didn't know, she could keep telling herself that perhaps she wasn't compatible, perhaps there was nothing she could do, and she could continue living her own life without having to give anything up. But if the result showed that she was a match, then there would be no excuse left to refuse. She said that for 2 years, she had walked past the testing room many times, and every single time she had turned around and gone home. Then, with her voice breaking, she said that out of everything she had done, what happened with Brandt wasn't the thing that kept her awake at night. What kept her awake was those 2 years. The fact that she had deliberately chosen not to know. Corinne stood there in the hospital hallway and felt something inside her crack open. Not anger, but a terrible compassion for the woman standing in front of her. A woman who had been cowardly enough to choose ignorance so she wouldn't have to do the right thing, and who had carried that cowardice to bed with her every night for 2 years. Corinne didn't hug her. She didn't say a single word of forgiveness. She only reached out, took the envelope, and said she would give it to the doctor. Adeline nodded, stepped back, then sat down in a chair at the far end of the hallway, about 15 steps away from her younger sister, and stayed there all night without daring to come any closer again. Emery remained beside Corinne throughout that entire night. He didn't leave for even a minute, didn't look at his watch once, didn't show a single sign of impatience. He brought her a cup of hot coffee that she never touched. When she began trembling from the cold and from fear, he took off his coat and draped it over her shoulders for the second time in her life. At around 4 o'clock in the morning, Corinne finally broke down and cried. And she told him everything she couldn't say to anyone else, that she hated what her sister had done so much she could barely breathe, but she still couldn't bring herself to hate her sister. That part of her wanted Adeline gone from her life, while another part was terrified of the day she might truly disappear. Emery didn't comfort her with empty phrases. He only held her hand more tightly and said that love and pain could exist inside the same heart at the same time. That the fact she still loved her sister after everything wasn't weakness, but proof that her soul was more beautiful than the wounds it had been forced to carry. When the sky began to brighten beyond the window at the end of the hallway, the doctor came out and said Ezra was past the critical stage. The transplant took place 6 weeks after that night, once Adeline had completed the center's entire evaluation process, and it was successful. 3 days after the surgery, Corinne walked into her sister's hospital room on a morning filled with sunlight. And for the first time since that night, at 3:47 in the morning, the two sisters truly faced each other without any roles left between them. Adeline lay there, her face hollow and exhausted, and tears spilled from her eyes the moment she saw her younger sister walk in, because she understood that Corinne's presence there was something she didn't deserve to receive. Corinne pulled a chair closer, sat down, and spoke very slowly, very clearly. She said she hadn't forgotten. She said what had happened would remain a scar inside her forever, that no one could give those 10 years back to her, that what Adeline had done couldn't be erased and shouldn't be erased, because if it were erased, then there would be no one left to remember the 17-year-old girl she had been. But Corinne said she was choosing to let go. She said she forgave her, not because Adeline deserved forgiveness, not because things could ever return to the way they had been, but because Corinne didn't want to carry hatred for one more day of her life. She said forgiveness was a gift she was giving herself, the only way she could unlock the chain binding her to the pain and finally move forward. Adeline broke down sobbing, and she took her sister's hand, whispering thank you through broken breaths, understanding that she had just been given a grace, greater than anything she had ever dared to hope for. When Corinne walked out of the hospital that afternoon, her chest felt strangely light, as though the invisible stone that had been pressing down on her for so many months had finally been lifted away. 1 year later, on an early autumn afternoon, when the trees lining the road behind Emery's house had turned brilliant shades of gold and orange, Corinne stood inside the small greenhouse at the far end of the garden, wearing a simple cream-colored dress and holding a bouquet of wildflowers she had picked herself along the roadside that morning. There weren't 180 guests. There was no enormous projection screen, no speaker system on both sides of the room, no expensive white floral arch. There were only a few people who truly loved her. Several former co-workers from the pastry kitchen, Rosalind Pike sitting in the front row with a handkerchief clenched tightly in her palm, and 21-year-old Ezra, healthy and strong, standing beside them as the best man, tall, his skin glowing with color, having returned to college 6 months earlier. He read a short blessing, saying that he had practiced in front of the mirror for 3 nights. But the moment he saw his sister in a wedding dress, he forgot every word, then added that if anyone still doubted whether men could cry, they only had to look at the groom today, and the entire greenhouse burst into laughter, including Emery. In the last row, Adeline sat quietly by herself, not as a guest of honor, only as someone who had been allowed to be there, and she understood that very clearly. When Emery took Corinne's hand, those fingers were still calloused, and the long scar still ran along her right forearm, but they no longer had to soak in cold soapy water at 3 o'clock in the morning. On her ring finger was her mother's silver wedding band. The woman standing beneath the glass roof that day was no longer the night shift baker who had carried her shoulders bent forward a year earlier, but a woman who had learned how to lift her head, who had walked through the deepest reaches of betrayal, and found not only a true love, but herself. Corinne's story reminds us that no one can truly take away a person's dignity, that it is only lost when that person chooses to lay it down. It reminds us that blood ties don't give anyone the right to hurt us, and that real family isn't defined by what is written on a birth certificate, but by the way people treat one another every day. And it reminds us that kindness given without calculation, even something as simple as a hot bowl of soup served to a stranger on a snowy night, may one day return to save us from the very place we least expect. If this story touched your heart, please press the like button and share it with the people you love, and subscribe to our channel so you can hear more meaningful and deeply moving stories every day. How do you feel about Corinne's journey? And if you had been in her place, what would you have chosen to do in that kitchen at 3:47 in the morning? Please leave a few lines in the comments so we can hear what is truly in your heart. We wish every one of you listening to this story abundant health, a joyful life, and peace in each and every day. Goodbye for now, and we look forward to seeing you again in the next video.